Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution area of Study 2 on the Russian Revolution area of Study 2. In this video, we will look at the Russian Civil War that took place from 1918 to 1921. Technically, the war ended at the end of 1920, but some related events took place in early 1921 that we'll touch on in this video. So here's a quote from Leon Trotsky. He said, "We are fighting to settle the question of whether the homes, palaces, cities, sun, and heavens will belong to the people who live by their labor, to the workers, peasants, and the poor, or whether they belong to the bourgeoisie." So clearly, from a Bolshevik perspective, the Civil War was an example of class warfare between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So the key knowledge that we'll touch on in this video include the challenges the new regime faced in attempting to consolidate its power, including the Civil War and Red and White Terror. I was going to touch on war communism, and I will mention it near the beginning of the video, but I'll save the majority of that to our next video. We'll also talk about the role of significant individuals that influenced and changed society, including Leon Trotsky, who was incredibly relevant to the Civil War, as well as Felix Dzerzhinsky. And we'll touch on the diverse revolutionary experiences of social groups. So let's start by looking at a timeline of the Civil War. So on the 22nd of May, 1918, the Czech Legion, who I will talk about very shortly, take control of a portion of the Trans-Siberian Railway. They ran amok during this period, just overthrowing provincial Soviets and reinstating new governments left, right, and center. So they were a significant threat to the Bolsheviks during the Civil War. On the 14th of June, 1918, right SRs and Mensheviks are expelled from all Soviets, really solidifying the Bolsheviks' control as a one-party dictatorship. On the 28th of June, 1918, the decree on nationalization marks the beginning of war communism. So like I said, I'll talk more about war communism in our next video, but basically it was the economic policies that the Bolsheviks implemented in response to the Civil War. In July 1918 was the introduction of class-based food rationing, which was a policy of war communism. On the 17th of July, 1918, Tsar Nicholas II and his family are executed by the Reds. Now, when I talk about the Reds, I mean the Bolsheviks. I'll talk more about the Reds versus Whites versus Greens shortly. Now, Tsar Nicholas was still alive at this point. He and his family had been under house arrest in Yekaterinburg, because the white armies, who were one side of the Civil War, were closing in on Yekaterinburg, and many of them wanted to reinstate Tsarism in Russia, the Reds felt it easier to just execute the Tsar and all of his family. On the 30th of August, 1918, socialist revolutionary Fanya Kaplan shoots and seriously wounds Lenin in an assassination attempt. Petrograd Cheka chief was also assassinated on the same day. So this marked a real turning point for the Bolsheviks, because only less than a week later, on the 5th of September 1918, they introduced the Decree on Red Terror in response to this counter-revolutionary act of attempting to assassinate Lenin. On the 21st of November 1918, a decree is introduced banning all private trade, which expanded the policies of war communism. In January 1919, grain requisitioning squads began, I'm not even going to try and pronounce this, Prodrezveska, which was basically the policy of taking grain from peasants without their consent, i.e. requisitioning grain. And that was in response to food shortages that were taking place all throughout Russia. On the 15th of May 1919, Sovnarkom instructs the state bank to increase print runs of banknotes, purposely bringing about hyperinflation so as to render money useless. They wanted a moneyless society under communism, and so this was a purposeful attempt to speed that process up. On the 4th of June, 1919, was the beginning of the Green Uprising in Ukraine, led by Makhno. I'll touch more on the Greens shortly. Oh, I forgot to make that go away. Anyway, I'll get to that shortly. On the 7th of February 1920 was the execution of Admiral Kolchak, who had named himself supreme leader and commander-in-chief of all Russian land and sea forces. He had set up his own government in Siberia, and he was executed in early 1920. On the 26th of April 1920, the Kiev offensive marks the beginning of the Soviet-Polish War, a war that took place simultaneously during the at the same time as the Civil War. In August 1920 was the outbreak of another green resistance under Antonov in the Tambov province. Then on the 12th of October 1920, an armistice was signed between Polish and Soviet governments, which effectively marked the end of the Soviet-Polish War, so it didn't last all that long. But a formal peace treaty wasn't signed for another few months after that. In November 1920, the last of the White Armies, I'll explain the White Army shortly, under General Wrangel is defeated. Now, this marks essentially the end of the Civil War. In February 1921, mass strikes begin in main cities. These are protesting against working conditions, as the policies of war communism had not been reined in at this point, even though the Civil War had officially ended. And it was also in response to food shortages in the cities. Now, that's very reminiscent of February 1917, when the International Women's Day protests marked the beginning of the February Revolution, and they were also in response to food shortages. Now, from the 1st to 17th of March 1921, we're not going to touch on these events in this video because they are worthy of their own video. There was the Kronstadt Uprising, as well as the Red Army response to the Kronstadt Uprising, and also the NEP, New Economic Policy, was introduced at the 10th Party Congress. So that was going back on the policies of war communism. On the 18th of March 1921, I don't know why that green thing is there. Anyway, the Treaty of Riga was signed between Poland and Soviet Russia. That was the official peace treaty of the Soviet-Polish War. And then from June to July 1921 was a disastrous harvest. A disastrous harvest led to a severe famine, killing 5 million people. So that's sort of a timeline of the Civil War. Let's get into some of those events now. So firstly, let's have a look at some of the internal threats that the Bolsheviks faced during the Civil War. So first, we have got the Czech Legion. I mentioned them at the very beginning of the timeline. They were a volunteer army consisting of 40,000, mostly Czech armed soldiers. Now, they were granted permission to cross Russia by rail so as to support the World War I Western Front. This is after the Eastern Front had already been won. And so the Czech Legion was going across the Trans-Siberian Railway to then make their way across to Europe, to the west of Europe, to support the Western Front. However, on their way across the Trans-Siberian Railway, hostilities broke out between the Czech Legion and provincial Soviets. These provincial Soviets felt threatened by the sheer number of armed foreigners, and so fights broke out. In response to this, the Czech Legion overthrew regional Soviet authorities and formed an SR-led government in Siberia. They then proceeded to just go back and forth on the Trans-Siberian Railway, fighting and overthrowing various provincial Soviets. Their actions provided the spark to inspire other groups to oppose the Soviet regime during the Civil War. The second internal threat was the White Armies. So these were separate armed forces who were united by their hatred for the Bolsheviks. Most of them were led by previous Tsarist officers, and many of the White Armies sought to re-establish Tsarism. However, there was no real unity between the White Armies. They were distinct, separate armed forces, not a united front, which would prove to be a challenge for them during the Civil War. So here are just 3 examples of white armies. So we've got General Yudenich, Northwestern Army, which threatened Petrograd in November 1919, but they were fought back, and Yudenich was was defeated. Admiral Kolchak's Siberian forces threatened from the east in 1919, and Admiral Kolchak had established his own government in Siberia. And then from 1918 to 1920, General Denikin led the Southern Army, which was the largest of all of the white armies. And the final internal threat that the Bolsheviks faced were the Green Armies. These were communities of peasant insurgents who didn't support either the Reds or the Whites. Anarchist Nestor Makhno and his peasant troops held southeast Ukraine. And then until mid-1921, the Tambov region, which was sort of slap bang in the middle of Bolshevik-controlled territory, was held by former SR Alexander Antonov and his army of 40,000 peasants. This region was pretty much a no-go zone throughout the Civil War for any Bolsheviks or Reds. Now, even though the Civil War is in essence a fight between the Reds and the Whites, Lenin saw the Green armies as the most concerning. He said peasant insurgents were far more dangerous than all the Denikins, Yudenichs, and Kolchaks put together. So I pointed out there that he's referring to the white armies. Now, there were also some external threats. So Britain, it was within Britain's interests to bring Tsarism back. They lived within in a monarchy. So they funded the white armies that aimed to reinstate Tsarism. By August 1919, Britain had spent £70 million to support white forces. Secondly, we've got Japan. So Japan, I mean, as we saw with the 1904 to 1905 Russo-Japanese War, they had hoped to, they were an imperial power that hoped to expand their empire. And so wishing to gain territory, 70,000 Japanese troops were sent to Siberia. Japan entered Siberia in April 1918, presenting a direct threat to the Bolsheviks. We've also got America, who sent forces to Siberia in August 1918, so as to protect the Trans-Siberian Railway and restrict Japan's accessibility to land. They supported Admiral Kolchak and his established government in Siberia. And finally, we've got the Soviet-Polish War, which I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about. I'll just give this information here. So it began in February 1920. Poland had declared independence from Russia and sought to expand its territory by invading Ukraine. So Poland had declared independence, by the way, in the sort of chaos of the beginning of the Civil War. And so now they wanted to take Ukraine, which had been lost during the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Bolsheviks saw an opportunity to inspire an international revolution by encouraging Polish workers to overthrow the government. But this was largely unsuccessful. They were, after all, seen by the Poles as an invading threat. The Treaty of Riga lost Soviet Russia territory, as well as 30 million rubles. But the Soviet-Polish War did come to an end in early 1921. So the Reds won. That's the main thing that you need to take away from this, is that the Civil War took place with all of these internal and external threats, and yet the Reds were victorious. So key factors in the Red Army success, we'll talk about their geographic advantages, their ideological unity, Trotsky's leadership, White Army weaknesses, and we'll also talk about Red Terror, the use of terror by the Bolsheviks. So in terms of geography, the Bolsheviks controlled Central European Russia. Why was that important? Well, they had a larger population in that area, which meant more potential recruits for the army. So they had 70 million people in Soviet Russia versus 10 million in white-held areas. They were also a more ethnically consistent population, which meant less language and cultural barriers, so more sort of unity between the people within Central European Russia. They also controlled major cities of Moscow and Petrograd, which meant that they had key factories, as well as access to both Tsarist and provisional government ammunition supplies. And finally, their geographic location and geographic advantages meant that they had access to an extensive railway system, which made it easier to transport supplies, as well as made it easier to deploy troops from front to front. The Civil War was really a war of movement. While the Bolsheviks were sort of surrounded on all sides, they were able to move quickly across their territory to support different campaigns. Secondly, we've got ideology. So the Reds had a united sense of purpose and vision. As Marxists, they believed that the eventual triumph of communism was inevitable. There was also a patriotic sentiment. So they were fighting for the homeland, they presented an ultimatum basically to all of the people in their territory: either fight for the homeland or choose the side of the traitors, Tsarism, and foreign interventionists. Also, propaganda was used really effectively to depict the conflict as both a class war against the capitalist bourgeoisie, as well as a patriotic defense against imperialist foreign invaders. Trotsky's leadership. So the Red Army, formed in January 1918, was led by Trotsky. He was a ruthless leader, and his ruthless leadership, here he is, by the way, down here, created a highly disciplined army. At the beginning of the war, the Red Army wasn't very big and suffered some defeats, but by 1920, the Red Army consisted of over 5 million men. Trotsky also conscripted 75,000 Tsarist generals as military experts. Now, while this may seem surprising, the reason that he did this, similarly to during state capitalism, how they maintained bourgeois experts within the factories, was because these Tsarist generals had a huge amount of military experience. They were... Sorry, someone just tried to walk in there. So had a huge amount of military experience. They either joined out of a sense of patriotic duty against these foreign imperialists, or they were coerced into joining through their families being kidnapped and held as ransom. So that was an interesting and controversial tactic by Trotsky. Because he couldn't entirely trust the Tsarist generals, political commissars were also attached to each commanding officer. And these political commissars would report back to the Central Executive Committee on the different Tsarist generals. Trotsky was also a very decisive leader. He had an armored car and train that he would take around the territories and lend support to the different fronts. This was also sort of he was able to spread propaganda through his decisive actions as leader. And he was a very inspiring leader. He was a great speaker, and he was able to really rouse support for the Red cause. Now, we've talked about why the Reds won. Now, why did the Whites lose? So there was a lack of coordination between generals, since they were really spread out. I haven't included a map in this video, but you should look at a map of the Civil War to see just how spread out the White armies were. They also had trouble motivating their troops and maintaining discipline, since there was a huge lack of ideological unity. As General Denikin said, "If I raise the Republican flag, I lose half my volunteers. And if I raise the monarchist flag, I lose the other half. But we have to save Russia." So what he's saying here is that we've got some people who support Tsarism, and some people who support a republic or support the Constituent Assembly. So I can't really lean into either of those sides, but we have to do what we can to unite to save Russia. Due to their ideological disunity, the whites were unable to gain popular support. This was also due to their geographical disadvantages. They also didn't use propaganda as well as the Reds, making them less likely to gain popular support. And ultimately, due to all of these things, they didn't offer a good alternative to the Communist Party. As historian Orlando Fage says, Red victory was more a result of white weakness than Red strength. So they're the four main factors to the Red Army's success, but another factor to the victory in the Civil War was the use of terror. So the Red and White Terror is a key knowledge point in the study design. Now, when it comes to White Terror, I'm going to just refer to the ATAR notes book here because there's a good bit of information about the White Terror. So with their use of the Cheka as a tool of terror, the Bolsheviks were no innocent lambs. However, Trotsky was a genius propagandist and was able to paint the whites as the greatest danger to Russia. The whites greatly lacked any sort of propaganda that would enable them to earn support, as they were no better than the Reds, whose actions during the war devastated the countryside. The one thing that rural communities benefited from the Bolshevik regime was the distribution of land, a policy that was openly hated by the whites, most of whom came from middle to higher social classes. The Bolsheviks were seen as the lesser of two evils in every aspect, especially since the whites' financial support from the Allies was used as an excuse by the Bolsheviks to paint them as traitors to Russia. Examples of white terror include burying socialists alive, nailing people to trees, destroying bridges, gouging eyes, cutting off tongues, tearing off limbs, and burning off skin. There was also a huge amount of anti-Semitic pogroms against Jews through the White Terror. So that's the whites committing terror. But let's talk about the Red Terror. So on the 30th of August 1918, Lenin was shot and seriously wounded. This attempted assassination was blamed on the bourgeoisie. Cheka deputy Yakov Peters said the bullet was directed not only against Comrade Lenin, but also the working class as a whole. On the 5th of September 1918, Sovnarkom passed a decree entitled On Red Terror, allowing for the creation of concentration camps to imprison class enemies and authorizing the Cheka to execute, quote, anyone involved in White Guard organizations, conspiracies, and rebellions. The Cheka was considered of equal importance to the Red Army in winning the Civil War. As Bolshevik member Martin Latzis said, the Cheka is not an investigating commission, a court, or a tribunal. It is a fighting organ on the internal front of the Civil War. It does not judge, it strikes. Here, Commissar of Justice Nikolai Kurilenko says, we must execute not only the guilty, execution of the innocent will impress the masses even more. Some key statistics about the Red Terror. So the Cheka exposed 142 counter-revolutionary groups in 1918 alone. And between 1918 to 1921, the Cheka executed 140,000 people and killed another 140,000 while suppressing uprisings. So that's in the space of 4 years, or 3 to 4 years. To make a comparison here, the Okhrana, which was the Tsarist secret police, political police, who we can sort of compare the Cheka and the Okhrana. The Okhrana, in the last 50 years of Tsarism, only executed 14,000 people. The Bolsheviks executed 10 times that amount in the space of 3 or 4 years. The Cheka was also in charge of overseeing conscription to the Red Army, border control, and exposing corruption within the Bolsheviks. So here are some historical interpretations of the Red Terror. So historians debate about whether the use of terror was a response to crises and threat, or whether it was a product of ideological intolerance. So on the one hand, we've got Orlando Fage, who says the Bolsheviks were forced to turn increasingly to terror to silence their political critics and subjugate a society they could not control by other means. So he's saying that the use of terror was a response to the crises that they faced. While Richard Pipes, on the other hand, says the Red Terror was not a reluctant response to the actions of others, but a measure designed to nip in the bud any thoughts of resistance to the dictatorship. So that's going the other way. It was a product of ideological intolerance. Dmitry Volkogonov, I don't know how to say his name, said the leaders of the revolution had become priests of terror. Like the sound of a bolt being shot, the two syllables Cheka would stop any conversation. And the guillotine of the Russian Revolution was the gun. So that's making a comparison to the French Revolution there. So that brings us to the end of this video on the Russian Civil War and the use of Red Terror. To summarize, as soon as the Bolsheviks took power, they faced threats both internal and external, both from people who wanted to reinstate Tsarism and those who wanted a constituent assembly. The Reds won the Civil War for a number of reasons. They had a geographical advantage. They had far more ideological unity. Trotsky presented himself as a key figure and military leader versus the sort of incompetence of the white generals. The White Army weaknesses was another reason for the Red victory. And the use of terror, the effective use of terror by the Cheka, which was done far more effectively than by the whites. So that brings us to the end of this video. Our next video will be on the policies of war communism, the economic policies that took place during the Civil War, following the policies of state capitalism. And so I hope you found this video interesting and useful, and I will see you next time.